Good afternoon and good evening, depending on where in the world you are today. Welcome to our webinar about succession planning. My name is Alex Bradshaw. I'm Client Development Manager here at Thomas. I run a team of 12 people who are solution experts, product experts, and also frontline client support consultants. And I'm joined today by two panelists and colleagues. Firstly, Dr Jennifer Surtees, who's our People, Teams and Culture Talent Manager.
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everyone.
And Joel Ockwell, Solutions Consultant in our Psychology team.
Hello.
Thank you all for joining us as we discuss the practicalities surrounding succession planning and how this differs across business contexts. Many of you might have joined our webinar following some communications about our current Thought Leadership series focusing on succession planning. You might have read our white paper and listened to our podcast with Professor Adrian Furnham and our Managing Director Kieran Morton. We will be referring to some of these themes from the white paper and the podcast throughout the webinar. So today's session is aimed at putting those theoretical and academic approaches into practice and understanding what succession planning feels like. Before we start talking to our panelists, I want to open some polls up to you. So if you could please go onto the system and vote. The first question we want to ask you, do you currently have a succession plan in place? And the second question we'd like to ask you is, if you do have a current succession plan, what's its focus? Is it C-suite and senior future leaders? Is it all managerial levels? Is it key strategic or operational performers, scarce role or knowledge-based experts, or is it more than one of these? As a manager in Thomas, of a team with specialist knowledge and expertise, the impact of losing somebody from my team is big. It means losing knowledge, skill, expertise, all of which take time to replace. The loss of knowledge is particularly significant. Documented information is great, but it's not the live experience that one of my client development consultants has been immersed in. Jen, as a talent manager in Thomas, what's the biggest impact when someone leaves?
I completely agree. First, when someone goes, they take their knowledge and their expertise, but I think it's always worth thinking about what happens, what they're leaving behind. And when someone leaves, they leave a gap, whether it's large or small, in the culture, and that obviously takes time to repair. They're an individual that operates within a really complicated ecosystem, and it's only when they leave that it becomes really clear how significant their contributions have been. And the impact might have been on one, a few, or many different people in the organisation, but depending on their sphere of influence they have in your company, it can certainly have an impact on the culture and the morale of those around them. So the extent of the damage can't be determined until somebody actually leaves.
Joel, can you add more regarding the impact when someone leaves a business?
Yeah, I think it's important to note at this stage that the impact of someone leaving a business isn't always going to be definitive, because there's so many factors that influence actually what the impact is going to be, and that can be hard to gauge until that person's actually left. So, for example, the grade someone was at or working at, the role they had, their sphere of influence, all these sorts of factors determine what the impact is for that organisation and the other employees. But if we consider a managerial role, for example, or below that level, here I think the biggest impact is that immediate loss of knowledge and skills. And it's not just that technical knowledge, because that can be replaced more easily. It's the less obvious knowledge about how we do things in this organisation, how we operate. What I'm referring to is the systems or the organisational knowledge that has taken time to build up. So learning the structure of the business, how teams interconnect, where the opportunities are going to come from to add value to that company. And ultimately, that immediate loss has a financial impact on the company because it takes time to build that up after someone's gone. But that's talking about managerial roles or below. For senior roles, I'm almost tempted to say there can be an impact on legacy.
I suppose that's particularly true with family-owned businesses where the leader is part of the brand.
Yeah, and in those cases there can be concern around preserving the heritage or the values that clients identify with, because ultimately those senior leaders are going to be ambassadors of it. But I mean, what we've talked about so far, it seems that the impact of someone leaving a business is always negative, but that's not always the case. Someone leaving a firm can also open up opportunities for others below them who might want to step into their role or step up in the organisation. There are two models that describe the psychological impact at an individual level that Jen's going to take us through.
Yes, Kubler-Ross studied the emotional journey that people who are grieving go through, from anger into acceptance. But later, she discovered that these emotions were processed in a similar way when experiencing change. I think that that's really capsulated by that first graph on the screen. This change curve has been widely cited throughout the change management literature, and interestingly, at the same time, Kelly and Connor were researching the positive change curve. That's on the right-hand side. That's used a lot now in coaching, but I think it actually aligns really nicely with succession planning, and particularly when someone leaves. There's definitely a dip in mood from denial into blame, confusion and doubt, but then you start to see people viewing the change as an opportunity that's opened up to them, and then therefore feeling a bit more motivated about it.
Jen, succession planning is more than just planning for what happens at senior levels of a business, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. As we've discussed earlier, the impact of losing someone and not being prepared for it is so significant. Businesses really need to be more proactive than simply planning for succession or reacting to it. Historically, it has been quite a reactive process. As human resource and talent functions become ever more aligned to strategy, succession planning is becoming part of talent management and succession management. Essentially, this means that it's not just a planning exercise on its own anymore. It becomes part of the philosophy about how you think about your talent within your business. As this new way of thinking starts to permeate your talent strategy, the focus becomes on continuous individual development and always thinking about where your talent will be aligned to next, to make sure that you're meeting your strategic goals as well as supporting them in achieving their own personal development needs. Of course, throughout this approach, you need to be measuring and assessing talent and therefore flexibly directing their development and their progression recommendations. We have a number of clients that we work with that take this approach across their business to retain, harness and develop their talent into the leaders of tomorrow. I think that's an increasing number of clients, isn't it, Joel?
I think that's right, and I think organisations are now starting to realise that succession planning was previously about filling roles, mostly senior roles, but now should really be an ongoing process. And this is particularly important when you consider the change organisations are going through, whether it's for economic reasons, political reasons, for example, the uncertainty caused by the EU referendum result, because you can't build someone up for a role in 2 years' time, because in 2 years' time, that role might look fundamentally different.
And is this what Adrian Furnham was referring to in the podcast?
Yes, I think it's a really good point, because now organisations, they're starting to see the value from embedding succession planning in an overall talent management process, instead looking for talent that could take up one of many roles in the future. And I want to talk through a case study example where we've helped a company achieve this, because I think it's a really great example. So for our audience listening in today, to give you all some background, this company had a very limited approach, or no strategic approach to talent management. They had facing several issues. For example, they had people spread across many sites, and this meant it was hard for them not only to identify talent, but also move the talent around their business. They'd recently introduced a new behavioural framework as well, and so they didn't know how people were performing in relation to this. So overall, the issue they came to us with was that they needed a more strategic approach. So we worked with this client. We supported them with designing a development centre to help them assess their people. This development centre consisted of multiple assessment methods. So we used case studies, we had interview questions based on their new behavioural framework. Presentations were incorporated in the development centre, and we used psychometric assessments as well. And this use of multiple assessment methods helped give us a rounded image of the people in their organisation. The use of Thomas assessments, so the psychometric assessments that I just referred to, also help them navigate the issue of assessing people's potential based on their current performance in the role. And I've discussed one or two problems with this already. And the outcome was the outcome of this was really positive. So this was something that was initially run just in one small department, but then later expanded across the entire organization, just because of how successful it was. It helped the organization provide insights into their people, help them sometimes resolve workplace issues. For example, there were a number of instances where they were able to challenge the subjective opinions that managers had about their talent. It allowed them to implement development plans to ensure individuals felt they were progressing and also sufficiently stretched, which allowed them to retain their talent more. And I mean, the biggest impact was also that it helped them alleviate the impact of when people ultimately did leave, because they knew where the people, the talent in their organisation sat.
Joel, is there an advantage to assessing and developing your talent in this way, so you don't need to hire from the outside?
Yes, there are advantages, and it relates to knowing the organisation because you've been inside it. So people are familiar with the structure of the business, they're familiar with the culture, they're familiar with how the company operates and the challenges it's facing. They don't take time to come up to speed with this because they're already there. And this has many benefits for performance. So for audience, there's some points on the slide that just talk about research that's been done into comparing internal versus external hires. So we look at some of the points. So external hires 7 times more likely to be dismissed with a short tenure. We look at performance of the organisation. So internal candidates hired drive twice as high share price growth compared to external candidates. External candidates might get paid more, but they also receive significantly lower performance reviews, and they're more likely to leave with a short tenure. So there are advantages.
But it's not just a one-sided picture. I think there's advantages to external hiring as well.
There are, and organisations ultimately need to hire externally, and they do so because it offers them unique advantages over and above internal ones. It could be that to give some examples, it could be that the organisation is expanding into a new market, expanding into a new industry, or it might be offering a new service or delivering a new client project where specific expertise or experience is needed that just for whatever reason doesn't currently sit in the organisation. It could also be that the organisation is failing, or a business unit isn't performing as well, and that they need a new perspective, or that culture change, for example, that the culture of the organisation has been identified as one of the reasons for failure. And so, and this is referring to another point Adrian made in the podcast, it's hard for internal people to change the culture of the organisation because it's normal to them, they're already embedded in it, and you need people to come in from the outside in order to have really effective culture change because it's not normal to them. They can pick up on what needs to change quicker.
So what steps can they take to get those hiring decisions right?
I think there's a number of things that can happen, and I think Adrian has highlighted some of these on the podcast and the white paper that came out previously. But I think the top thing that you need to do is make sure that you're really specific about the role requirements. Also, take time to consider, has that role changed? And will it change in the next 12 to 18 months? And if so, what are the characteristics that you need now? And what are the ones that you're going to need in order to keep up with that change? You need to then look for measurements that will allow you to assess candidates for those characteristics, whether they be internal or external. Once you've got those competencies and skill sets really clear for the role, you can start to overlay the psychological characteristics that you need from that individual and start to unpick the person's specification in much more detail, of course. And then finally, I think it's about making sure that, yes, testing, psychometric testing is really important, but you can't do it on its own. It's not enough on its own. However, you can't make a serious decision without including it in some way in order to challenge your perspective and also to make sure that you've got a quantitative measurement and to have legally defensible decisions. I think the final point is that succession planning is a continuous investment and process. So let's not forget that even though we're externally hiring, make sure that we're always looking at making sure that we're doing the right thing.
At Thomas, we've supported clients with this in the past, haven't we?
We have, and we've taken the approach that Jen just described, but we've also used it in conjunction with what we call the Thomas Ideal Job Profiling tool. So to give our audience just a brief overview of the tool, so this essentially asks key stakeholders who are presumed to know the role best to give insights into a role, and the tool then uses that information to say how suitable different candidates are. And the overall aim is to help organisations get hiring decisions right. So it asks several key questions from stakeholders. So what characteristics are needed in the role, and then how important are those characteristics, and finally, what are the optimum levels of those traits that somebody's going to need. It then, once it's collected all this information from stakeholders, it then averages the ratings given by them to create an ideal profile, and then what it then does is assesses candidates against that profile to provide what we call an overall goodness of fit score. So this goodness of fit score tells us how far away candidates are from the ideal levels in the job role, and it also provides insights into derailers. So someone might be suitable, but also highlight what potential limitations this could be for this person in the role. This is something, there's another case example I want to talk about as well in terms of how we've used this. So we worked with a multinational organization who were recruiting externally for a very senior position. So this was a senior director role, and they advertised the position externally because for whatever reason the expertise, the experience they wanted didn't currently sit in the organization, and they wanted our support in getting the decision right, essentially. So we used the Thomas Ideal Job Profiling tool. We used subject matter experts' opinions to identify what does good look like in this role, and that based on what good looks like, we used the information in conjunction with the tool to give guidance on what candidates would be most suitable for this role, and the outcome was really positive. So the candidate actually came out top based on the selection process, and based on the psychometric results provided by this tool was actually the one they had their eye on. So it wasn't a case of actually the psychometric assessments providing different insights to the opinions of the people managing the selection process. It allowed them to give confidence to their decision making that this was the person who was most suitable, but it also allowed them to explore some potential derailers that this person might face in the role based on their psychometric assessment results, and that was a really positive thing as well.
Some really key points here. Firstly, measuring and nurturing leadership potential internally is advantageous to organisations, but external knowledge and skills can add value as well. And also, organisations must ensure that external hires have the potential to succeed. So let's explore an ideal approach to succession management. Where do we start?
I think first step is always making sure you're very clear on what your future needs are. Approach your senior strategic members of your business, understand what their strategic plans are, and by identifying that this process is going to help you achieve those future goals, you're guaranteed to get buy-in. Next step, identify your key positions and make sure that you're very clear on which positions you're going to include. Also consider the feeder positions that are maybe below in your hierarchy to make sure that you're considering what happens when the person moves into their new role, who takes over their role. And it's also about making sure that you're very clear on what the competencies and behaviours are of successful incumbents. And you might want to perform some kind of an analysis and benchmark to inform your framework further. The final point from me before I hand over to Joel is probably selecting candidates can be something that people tend to fall to by default. Opening up your high potential program to a particular area of your business is really positive because it allows people who might not be currently demonstrating potential to put themselves forward, but of course you might want to target people who you've already identified as important for your talent program.
I think that makes for a very inclusive approach as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once you've got the pool of candidates that you want to invite forward to that, or that you have included in your high potential program, I think the next thing you need to do is assess them, essentially. You want to assess them for potential, and you also want to assess them for performance as well, and we've already talked about how the two should be distinguished. And you can do this by using multiple methods of assessment. So in terms of just the general process, you can use assessment centres, you can use psychometric assessments, multiple psychometric assessments, performance measures, and any other KPIs that you might want to use as well that are relevant in the context of your organisation. Once you've assessed them, it's then how do you use that information. So developing training plans based on the outcomes of this program that will help you nurture the people, the individual strengths, and allow them to address any potential shortcomings the organisation might perceive in their high potential. And I mean, finally, for me, for this to work, it needs regular commitment from both sides. From the individual, they have to be embedded and engaged in that process, and from the organisation. So allowing managers to commit time to have regular discussions to make sure that these candidates are on track.
I think that's so key, because I think the follow-up from the assessment is so important to make sure that that people and your organisation are still on track with what your plans with the plans that you've made. You might want to conduct panel reviews or assessment centres on a more regular basis, so on a yearly review basis. But the key is making sure that your plans remain flexible and appropriate all time. So I think the final message from me is monitor it and evaluate it.
And flexibility is key, because I mentioned already the change organisations are going through.
Great. So employees leaving can have a significant impact, both in terms of cost to a business, but also on the psychological impact on the employees, which of course can be negative, but it can be positive as well. Succession planning isn't just reacting to a senior person leaving. It should be a continuous investment and process, and the organisations we've worked with at Thomas, we've helped them to achieve this, and they've reaped the rewards. Internal hiring and external hiring offer unique advantages, but regardless of which approach is taken, there are several steps businesses can take to give them the best chance of getting it right, such as being specific about what characteristics are needed for the role, and using measures to assess for those characteristics. Finally, while using multiple psychometric assessments is the best approach, they should be used in conjunction with other methods of assessment. So before we go to your questions, let's take a quick look at the polls from earlier in the webinar. Okay, so the majority of our audience indicating that they don't have a succession plan in place currently. And the second question? So quite an overwhelming percentage of the audience indicating that it's actually more than one of these areas that is the focus of a succession plan that's currently in place. Okay, thank you very much for taking part in our polls. We're going to start by addressing some of the questions and common themes that we've had from this morning's webinar. Jen and Joel, anything interesting?
Yeah, from this morning we had several questions come through, and I think that you'll agree, Jen, that some key themes came through on all the questions. Firstly, there were some questions around actually how do we go about doing a succession plan, and I think we've addressed that throughout the webcast. But there's also some themes about retention and attrition and how succession plans can help in this area. I mentioned on the webcast this morning how actually continual investment in your talent, continual nurturing your talent, giving them stretch opportunities, making sure they're constantly developing, that they never feel there aren't enough opportunities for them to develop, and that the organisation really does see a future in them. It's really going to help them in terms of their engaging with the organisation and making sure that they really feel that they do have a future in the company going forwards. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Jen.
Yeah, I thought there was a really good question around how to ensure succession planning process is fair and equitable. I thought that was really interesting because it ties in again to using more than one method of assessment and not just relying on things like annual reviews or line manager observations or even just network impressions. It really is important to make sure that everyone has access to a development and talent program, and it means that you've got a continuous talent pipeline as well. So making sure that it doesn't feel exclusive is very, very important, and that's why we outlined the additional approach to both opening it to invitation, but also targeting key individuals in your business that you believe to have high potential.
So those are the themes that came up this morning.
Should we take a look at some of the questions that are coming in?
Yeah, do you want to pick some out?
Absolutely. Here's a good one. What action do we take if we've placed an individual in our succession plan and over time they're displaying a change of behaviours? How do you communicate that the person is not getting the job?
That's an interesting one. The last line strikes me. So how do you communicate that that person is not getting a job? So I mean, throughout the webinar, we've already addressed how succession planning shouldn't be about building someone up for a particular role. It should be looking across your organisation at the people in your organisation and saying, what talent is there, and what people are in your company that could do one of many jobs in the future, have the potential to do one of many senior roles. So it's not just about saying, in 2 years' time, we think this person is going to be doing this role, because things change. So I think that's a very important thing to address. With regards to change of behaviours, so I mean, I guess this comes back to making sure they're being nurtured in the right way.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd probably want to understand whether when the kind of succession plan was communicated, was it communicated alongside some caveats around that, you know, we aspire to have you in this particular role, but this is dependent on you fulfilling the development that we're suggesting, and also making sure that your performance is what we're expecting of you throughout that period of time. I think it's really important how your outcomes from the assessment process is communicated, because it's really important to set expectations from both sides. Are there any other questions that you can see on there, Joel?
I'm just having a look through now. Do bear with us one moment. So there's one come up. So just read. So it seems that this client is using, he wants to understand the impact of using a limited number of assessments. So he said, by just using your PPA and GIA assessments, will those tools be sufficient to identify the ideal candidate for any succession planning exercise?
I think from kind of our discussions today, I think from us, clearly the answer is absolutely not. There's many psychological traits and soft skills and abilities that can be measured through psychometric assessments. You know, using our PPA, which the person mentions, which is our behavioural tool, and the GIA, which is our aptitude and ability test. However, there's a number of factors that you can't control for associated with someone completing an assessment, as well as several things that you'd struggle to measure, such as experience and how someone might approach a task in detail.
And if you're using a limited number of assessments, you might miss out on very important information that will allow you to make a more confident, more informed decision. So, for example, the high potential trait indicator, that's a tool Thomas provides. To use that as an example. So this measures 6 key traits that have been shown to be most predictive of performance in senior executive leadership. So if you're using a limited number of assessments, you might miss out on key measurements that will actually give you a better understanding of how that individual is likely to perform later on in the role. And so, I mean, using as many assessments as possible is obviously best practice. If you can only use 2 or 3, or if you think that's for whatever reason in your organisation, that's all you can do, that's fine. But using more is going to allow you to make better, more informed decisions.
Yeah, and I think using interviews, group exercise, portfolios, presentations, getting them to deliver a learning journal at the end of the process, you know, things like that, it can really support your decisions and make sure that you've got a real wealth of objective data that you've collected on that individual. Additionally, we've outlined the Thomas Job profiling tool, which can really help increase certainty of your decisions. But an even more robust way of this would be to do a statistical analysis of the characteristics that work for you in your culture.
And if you can only use a limited number of assessments, then try use the ones that are most predictive of whatever outcome it is you want to measure.
Great, thank you very much, Jen and Joel. I'm conscious we've not managed to get through every one of our audience's questions this afternoon. We've had some fantastic questions from everyone. We will respond to them directly with you in the coming days. You can, of course, get in touch with us direct should you wish to do so at info@thomas.co.uk, which is just coming up on your screen right now. So thank you for taking time out of your busy days to join us, and we wish you a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.